her parents are there. So Billy Malone came. But would you like to tell us a little bit about Billy Malone and the house, maybe? Could you do
Well,
that?
I know that they moved into this in 1824, and he built the farm to 700 acres.
Is this okay?
Whatever you like.
So the problem was that he'd gone into debt building the farm to that thing, so that size. So immediately after that, the court basically took Mariah to court and said she had to settle some debts and probably had to sell some land and slaves in order to settle those debts. So they did lose some things, and I've got that Xerox
It's
for
chickens
you.
under the porch.
All the stuff that I got out of the Rutherford County Archives building and everything. Anyway, she continued on and managed the best she could. And every once in a while, I guess she would have to sell a portion of the land. And one of her sons was killed in the Battle of Chickamauga. And he had inherited a chunk of land that's right on the other side of Dinky Lane and went down to Fall Creek.
Kind of where the cemetery is. So.
To the...
Just the side of it?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Where's he buried at?
Who?
The one that's
George? George Malone? Probably Marietta, Georgia,
Okay. I know.
because all the soldiers were quickly buried,
Yeah.
and then 6 months later they went in and dug them up and took them to Marietta, Georgia. There's a big Confederate cemetery there.
Okay.
So
Do
I
you-
don't know if he has a marked grave or if he's just lumped in with everybody.
Bruce, do you know what regiment he was in?
Yes, 18th Tennessee Infantry.
Okay. Hadn't heard of that one. We'll add that to the list.
18th, 40th, and 20th. No, it was 20th. 45th and 20th were big in this area. That's awesome.
Yeah, he was a second lieutenant. I think he was 23 years old. So he never made it back. But anyway, he had a section of land there, and then when he died, it got divided up between his brother Richard and a sister and somebody else. And then Richard fell into financial difficulties, and they sold his property on the county courthouse steps. I've got the date in there, I can't remember what it was, but he lost that land. But Tom and Heavy Malone bought a portion of it. They bought like a third of it. And what they did, they started going in and cutting timber off of it. And the other people took them to court, and in the Rutherford County Archives building, they have a folder on this whole case. It even shows the sheriff's summons, to have her show up at court to settle this dispute.
Talking about Mariah there.
Yeah, Mariah. It was addressed to Mariah. It was a sheriff's summons. And so they took her to court and lost. Mariah lost, and the court said that to stay off that land, because the only thing that made the land valuable was the timber that was on it, and she was required to pay the court costs of this whole ordeal. And that was, I think, it started in 1874 and ran to like 1778. And then the last mention of her anywhere in any records is the 1880 census. There's not another entry that I've found yet. I'm still hoping to find some.
And she was over here in 1880
Here.
Yeah,
she was right here.
on this house.
She was
Okay.
in this house, but she was no longer the head of the household according to the census. She had always been that on all the other ones, but in 1880, Tom Malone became the head of household. So her health had to have been probably failing at that point.
Tom was, I believe, the youngest son. He never married, so.
Yeah, he was born in 1844, probably in the upper room.
And this, and then Betty and Bob bought it from out of state, I believe. Is that correct?
He sold it to them. They started proceedings, I think, in 1898 or something. I think that's when it was legally recorded, so it was probably 1897 when they started the proceedings to sell 130 acres, I think it was.
And just so everybody knows, this is Bruce Werme and Asta Werme, who are our hosts here today. And here's Adam, their son. And when this house was bought by Betty and Bob Henderson, and we saw their headstone just a minute ago, and that estate, after they passed away, after Betty and Bob passed away, their youngest son continued to live here, and the estate was never divided. It wasn't until, was it 70s?
He died in 79.
79.
And I think we bought it in 80, didn't we? Spring of 80.
And they bought it and restored it.
In public auction.
I've got a videotape of that somewhere that my dad took.
And so thankfully,
It was thanks to him that any of it happened.
I know, I
house
saw the
and this property
documentation.
has been in the family since 1824, when Billy Malone first bought it. And when he bought it, there was nothing but, there was a log house here.
Yeah, you can come in and see it.
And the log house is amazing, and then Billy Malone added on to it, and we're of course on the back door here, but it has the classic, old-fashioned southern mansion with the big columns and
They
all.
called it an
Which
eye
you all
house.
completely, and they weren't even there, they had fallen off. And it was just crazy, kind of condition things have gotten in, but you've restored it, it's spectacular, it's now officially one of the Tennessee Century Homes, I believe is the correct designation.
Yeah, the sign is at the end of the driveway. Everybody asks me, how come you have a sign that says you're a country home? But it says Century.
But that means that it's been continuously in the family for 100 years.
Farmed.
Over 100 years.
Farmed. Continuously farmed.
Yeah, continuously.
And we got the updated sign to 175 years, and it won't be long before the 200 years. Wow.
75, I think it's
So-
only 100.
Yeah,
How does that rank in the state?
Almost 200 years.
If we could
200 years
prove
in
a
the same
paper
family.
trail
But
to
our
when the house
ancestors
was
came
built,
here.
we'd
Yeah.
have the oldest one in Rutherford County. But
One-
we don't know if we're related to them or not.
The Smith.
Who was that?
Whoever built the house.
Oh, right.
Which I
Like
find
this
bizarre.
place
This is my
there is
family.
a spring right on the other side of this building here. It's down in what looks like a sinkhole, but it's an everlasting spring, and you go down there, it's like a stream running through, and it's amazing, and it's cold, and it's clear, and it's clean, and it's just wonderful water. It's a great place here.
That's why the guy built the log cabin here, because the water was right there. It's pure.
Is the date, but he had given some land to the Methodist Church for a campground. Now, back in the early 1800s, people were flung all over the country. They weren't, like in a neighborhood. Your closest neighbors were a long distance away, so you didn't see people very often. So the Methodist Church, they did something they called camps, and they would have circuit riders, and so the preacher would get on a horse and go from camp to camp, and they would hold revivals at these camps, and everybody would come and literally camp at these campgrounds. So Billy Malone provided them some acreage to camp on, and also access to the spring. And that continued up until the Civil War. Actually, they even built a little Methodist church. It's called the Shady Grove Methodist Church. But that church, the building got trashed during the Civil War. It was unused and just became in really bad shape. And after the Civil War, Mariah's nephew, can you remember his name? I can't remember his name right now. Was,
Byron?
maybe I think that was that. Yeah.
Byron.
Was it Hoover? No,
Black?
it was Black.
Byron Black.
Yes. He built Kelly's Chapel at Walter Hill. And so the Methodist congregation moved to Walter Hill, and that church, the Kelly's Chapel, is still running there. And there's a really interesting Belmont.
Well, Kelly was Nathan Bedford Forrest's second in command. He was his David Campbell Kelly, which I did some signage for in the Cumberland River in Nashville. He was called the Fighting Parson. He was a missionary in China before the Civil War. He ran for governor on the Prohibitionist ticket in 1890 or 1870.
Yeah.
And he laid the foundation for Vanderbilt University before the war. He wanted to make it a Methodist university, and it was him and McKendree. You don't hear much about his connection, probably because, you know, his connection with Forrest. But he specialized. He was an artillery guy, and he specialized in fighting the U.S. Navy on the rivers, the Brownwater Navy, and was in the Battle of Nashville at Kelly's Point, which I was involved in the park and the signage I designed back there. So interesting fellow.
So that St. Kelly, you say you had a relation to Kelly's Chapel?
Yeah, David Campbell Kelly. He was born in Leesville, Wilson County. That log cabin, my brother said, on the square is his, but they cut it the second floor off, I think. It was a 2-story. So that's... it's all connected.
It just starts connecting to all sorts of stuff. But so the Methodist Church went away, and then Betty and Bob gave land to Alice Chapel. I think I got that right.
Well, actually, Tom Malone
Oh
started
no,
it,
that's right. Yes.
and then Bob and Betty gave him more.
Yes.
And then at a later date, I think in the 1920s, they gave him
So there's
a
been-
little bit more too.
Yeah, so the Palace Chapel, and there's actually Henderson Park over at Palace Chapel because of the family making all these donations. So really close ties. 2 of the founding members were our ancestors. So
You had 2 armies here in 2 different wars. You had the Union, which were encamped all around here. I found 2 Civil War shells not far from here. But you also had Patton's army was training for the invasion of Italy. And if you go back here, you'll see a bunch of, probably still back there, fire pits with M1 carbines scattered around.
Of course, that big pit on the end of the field is they dug that too as like a bunker, you know, to practice with.
Yeah, I heard that, and it's a
When
pond.
I was a youngster, he had a friend, and I told him that story, and he took my metal detector out there and came back with a whole box full of
Yeah,
cartridges. They all say 1943 on them.
yeah, yeah. They were all over here with their tanks, and
I
from
found a
here to
ball
Lebanon.
pin too from a Spec 4 sergeant.
Really?
Out there.
oh my God.
I mean, you can't. It's just everywhere you go, there's something. You know, it's amazing.
How about Schoolhouse Field? That's on the Henderson place, wasn't it?
The what?
The old school years and years ago?
Yes. It's right
Was it on the Henderson place?
Yes, and it's actually on Allen Barrett Road. You just went up the driveway and went up the hill.
Oh, right.
Top of the hill. Below the Powell Chapel.
It had to be leveled because if you study the picture, you see it. Some of it had to be cut in. And some of it doesn't, and some of it doesn't need a touch.
You see the picture?
With plaster and lately, you can see how far I see it. It's scary to
But it
death.
didn't affect the street.
I was terrified of that. When they put the rock wall.